One of the most controversial stories among film fans in recent memory has no doubt been the James Cameron 4K restorations of a number of his classics. Throughout their home video history, some of his movies have been frustratingly unavailable, such as The Abyss and True Lies, which only ever came out in standard definition DVDs that weren't even 16:9 enhanced in the old days of home theaters. Fans should have been celebrating the fact that these movies were now available at long last, but once they made their digital debut, consternation among film fans reached a boiling point on social media, especially as far as True Lies went. Many posted screenshots claiming that Cameron had slathered AI all over the films to thoroughly change the way they looked, and indeed, as a fan who grew up watching movies like this in the 90s, True Lies looks, well, a little different. You see, Cameron enlisted the aid of a company called Park Row Post, which is owned by Peter Jackson. Some of their work over the years has been striking, with them allowing Jackson to use film clips that were over 100 years old in his World War I documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old. He also used this on hours of Beatles footage for his Get Back documentary. Judiciously applied AI was able to make these vintage elements look new, and Cameron used some of this tech on the 4K restorations of his movies. Now, it should be noted that Cameron's films have always been somewhat controversial when they hit home video. Back in the year 2001, The Terminator was re-released on DVD in a pretty spiffy transfer, but the soundtrack was remixed in Dolby Digital 5.1 and the mono track was not made available, and a lot of fans took issue with the way that the movie sounded. Cameron, you see, has always been one that's been kind of obsessed with technology and has always been eager to bring his work up to date. However, this has sometimes caused some consternation among film purists. Studio Canal's 4K transfer of Terminator 2 Judgment Day has long been mocked for sporting a waxy digital look. When the 4K transfers came out in December, it was True Lies that received the most controversy. Now, let me explain this a little bit. True Lies would have never looked in 4K the way that some of the really huge blockbusters of that era look. You see, the film was shot in a format called Super 35, which was basically spherical. The reason James Cameron did this was that when his movies were transferred to home video, rather than just lop off the sides of the image like he would have to do had he shot it in Panavision, using spherical format, he was able to add extra information on the top and bottom of the screen, which made the transfers less of an eyesore. The problem is, the film stock was faster, so when they were blown up, there was a little bit of grain. You couldn't really notice this on VHS, you certainly couldn't notice it on DVD, and probably even in Blu-ray and an HD transfer, it wouldn't have really been that noticeable. But in 4K, the movie would have looked, not bad, but it wouldn't have looked great. Remember when Shout Factory put out a 4K edition of Point Break not too long ago? A lot of fans said that they didn't find the movie looked all that great or even much different than it did in HD, and the reason for that is the fact that that film, which was also produced by James Cameron, was actually shot in Super 35. So basically, if they had just put True Lies on 4K disc as is, it would have looked a lot like Point Break, and I think that film fans would have been complaining. They're complaining now, but they would have still complained, and they would have said, oh, the movie doesn't look as good as it should have, and they should have done something to it. So you really can't always win with these things. However, a lot of people think that James Cameron went way too far with True Lies, and indeed, some of the screenshots that are out there on X are pretty striking. And as somebody who grew up watching these movies, I mean, it can't be denied that Cameron really has done something akin to what film preservationist Robert Harris called in an email to me a revisualization, in which he didn't change the negative of the film, he created an all-new digital version of the film, which, well, looks a lot different than it used to. If you watch True Lies now, it looks like it was shot last year, not 30 years ago, which, you know, is something that a lot of film purists don't really like. They want grain in their films. They want it to look like film, and if you watch True Lies on 4K, it certainly does not look like it was shot on Super 35. Another movie that this was very problematic for was James Cameron's Aliens, which has always had a very, very, very grainy look because the film was shot on very high-speed film stock. And in fact, when it was blown out to 70mm back in the 80s, it was notable for how bad people thought it looked because the grain was so pronounced. And even if you watch this movie on the Blu-ray HD transfers, you can see that Aliens actually has quite a bit of film grain to it, which has been removed in these new AI-assisted 4K transfers. To me, Aliens actually looks really good, And Robert Harris is one of the people that actually agrees with me, and he wrote in an email that he thought that Cameron definitely had the right to do these kinds of restorations as long as, the original negative still existed, which was a problem with some of the films that Harris has worked on in the past, including Lawrence of Arabia. Film preservationists are really dedicated to negatives being restored, and indeed, sometimes if you don't properly store or restore a negative, movies could become lost. A good example of this is John Wayne's movie, The Alamo. Now you see, The Alamo was released in a couple different versions. There was a theatrical version which was short, but there was also a roadshow version in 70mm, which was significantly longer. And the elements for that have apparently badly degraded over time, to the point that they're now basically unrestorable. So that version of the movie, in effect, is lost. The version of The Alamo that exists now by John Wayne is simply the theatrical version, which is kind of a shame because it's terrible to see any movie get completely lost. So, the controversy surrounding James Cameron's 4K transfers started to rear its ugly head again around the time that The Terminator got announced as coming out in a 40th anniversary edition that, of course, would be in 4K. So, this actually hasn't come out on disc or digitally yet, but I did see the movie in a theatrical release here in Montreal in 4K. And I have to say, it looks quite a bit like Aliens does, where all grain has been removed from the film, and I have to say that The Terminator was a movie that was relatively low budget at the time and never really looked like it was this huge budget film, which is kind of not necessarily the case now. I mean, Cameron didn't go crazy. He didn't change any VFX shots. He didn't really do anything to totally alter the way that the movie looked, but it looks smooth and slick in a way that I don't remember when I used to see it on VHS and even DVD. It would be nice if Cameron was to make the kind of more vintage-looking versions of his movies available too, so that home video enthusiasts could choose which one they want. The ironic thing is that I think that most mainstream audiences would probably choose these revisualizations because, well, they don't really know the difference, do they? It's really film preservationists and hardcore film fans that have kind of an issue with what he's doing. Cameron himself, though, has been very unsympathetic, it has to be said. He recently gave an interview where he addressed the 4K controversy, and well, let's just say he didn't mince words. In fact, he said the following: "When people start reviewing your grain structure, they need to move out of mom's basement and meet somebody, right? I'm serious. I mean, are you f***ing kidding me? I've got a great team that does the transfers. I do all the color and density work. I look at every shot, every frame, and then the final transfer is done by a guy who's been with me for years. All the Avatar films are done this way. Everything is done this way." Gail Ann Hurd, who was the producer on the original Terminator as well as Terminator 2, actually told me in an interview that she fully supported James Cameron's right to do whatever he wanted with the visual look of those movies because, well, they're his movies. And if fans really had a problem with what he was doing, they should go out and make their own movies and then do whatever they wanted with them. She did acknowledge the fact that, to some extent, film fans do feel a certain degree of ownership over those movies, but to her, it was really his prerogative as a director and filmmaker to do whatever he wanted because he is an auteur in the true sense of the word. All of which, of course, brings me to a point. Should a director ever be able to kind of engage in revisionist filmmaking? One of the worst examples of this, of course, is what George Lucas did with the original Star Wars trilogy. Steven Spielberg even kind of got involved with that a little bit too when he re-released E.T. on its 20th anniversary with all the guns removed by a CGI and replaced with walkie-talkies. He soon saw the light and restored the original version, but also, you've got things like Raiders of the Lost Ark having a new title, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, which I always found kind of annoying. As film fans, we don't like to see our classics, messed with. And, Cameron, he never really changed anything fundamental about the films, but he definitely has changed the way they looked and are represented on home video. At the end of the day, of course, fans simply have to vote with their wallet. If you don't like what James Cameron has done with the 4K versions of his movies, simply don't buy them. But I also do understand the fact that some film fans are kind of concerned with the way that AI could really change the way that movies are restored. In fact, there's already some evidence that AI is becoming a big part in the way movies are being transferred to these new 4K editions. A good example of that is what recently happened with Jaws 3D. Now, you see, Jaws 3D was shot in a very cheap way in which the 35mm film was kind of split in half and then doubled to create the 3D effect. So every version that we were seeing of Jaws that wasn't in 3D up until now was basically a transfer from a 16mm copy of the movie, giving it a very cheap, kind of crappy look. If you watch it now on 4K on Peacock or digitally, it looks wildly, wildly different because Universal basically used AI to make it look, well, like a much more expensive, slickly shot film. A lot of people are not going to be bothered by that, but a lot of film preservationists really don't like that, and in fact can nitpick and pick out some pretty crappy things about the transfers because, well, AI isn't always perfect, right? I mean, you could sometimes change the look of a movie, but then sometimes it has some rather unfortunate side effects, which, are being dug into on social media. But I think for the majority of film fans, they don't even really notice that what's happening, and I suppose that a lot of people would just be able to put on Jaws 3D and just be grateful for the fact that it doesn't look like crap, which is how it's always looked. So, the 4K transfers are controversial, and I have to say, as a film fan, I kind of do wish that Cameron put out two versions of the movies, the unrestored version and then these revisualizations, and I'd probably go back and forth as to which version that I wanted to watch, but truth be told, I would probably watch the new spiffy revisualizations of something like Alien, whereas I think I'd rather see more of the old school 35mm transfer of a movie like True Lie. But hey, that's just me. Everybody's got their opinion, and we want to hear yours. So let us know in the comments what you think of these James Cameron transfers.
Get another one, you moron!
I think I have one in the truck.